Hello, everyone, and welcome to AliQRu. We are continuing the series in cooperation with Yerevan Press Club and Baku Press Club, where we have speakers from Armenian-Azerbaijani backgrounds discussing specifically issues related with security, conflict, and other matters of concern for Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Today, we have two excellent guests, both living outside of Armenia and Azerbaijan. We have Lala Darchinova, editor at Caucasus Edition with Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation, researcher at Law Department of European University Institute in Florence. And we have Philippe Gamaghelyan, who is a professor assistant at University of San Diego, Kroc School of Peace Studies, and also an editor of Caucasus Edition with Imagine Center for Conflict Transformation. Hello, colleagues, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting.
Hi, Arsen. Thank you for inviting.
You both have been extensively involved in dialoguing, both academically and in practice between Armenians and Azerbaijanis for many, many years. And today, considering the realities on the ground, I would like to start with a general question to maybe discuss and explore options for anything that can be close to conflict resolution between Armenia and Azerbaijan, or Armenians and Azerbaijanis, post-2020 war, post-September 2023. Where are we? What are our chances? And where are we going in general in sense of discussing possible outcomes for a peaceful resolution and or transformation? Let's start with Lala.
Okay, that's a very difficult question to start with, actually. I don't know. I don't want to start with a pessimistic note, but I don't see any political will, at least from Azerbaijani side, to do the reconciliation. And the indicators for me are that the rhetoric of extreme nationalism and the rhetoric of enmity is not decreased yet. That's why, and also in addition to that, I don't see any concrete plan or any suggestions or policy how this reconciliation will look like. And when we don't have this, and when we are in an uncertain situation, it's very hard to speak about the reconciliation efforts from the government side or any prospects for reconciliation. We also are far, probably, from signing the peace agreement, and we don't know where we are, to be honest. So all these uncertainties and all these questions don't give me a pessimistic picture that we are close to reconciliation or any kind of process starting on a political level, of course, on government's level, to reconcile. But meanwhile, I think on a grassroots level, we still continue doing whatever is possible within this restricted political environment to do peace building and build basically bridges and try to build some kind of reconciliation on the people's level, at least, let's say. Yeah, that's it for now.
Thank you, Lala. Probably the same question goes to you, Phil. How do you feel about what's the state of affairs for prospects for any form of reconciliation or peace?
Thank you. Since we invited somewhat of a scholar practitioner, I'll have to put a bit of a scholarly spin on this and say, like, at least we can differentiate between different ways of approaching conflict. One way of thinking of it is conflict management, resolution, and transformation. So in terms of resolution, I would agree with Lala that I don't see much prospects. And what I mean by resolution is something that we could have had, for example, in 1990s, essentially when the parameters stay, the nation states stay, in a sense, a lot of things stay same, but there is a peace agreement that is somewhat sustainable. And the reason I think it was possible in 1990s and probably not since is because there was somewhat of a bigger picture agreement on where the future can look like. And that was to be liberal democratization, European integration, human rights, minority rights, borders somewhat being secondary, similar to the European experience. So it was this bigger picture. So wherever Karabakh ended up, autonomy, the referendum, whatever it was, in some form, again, this bigger picture was clear. The bigger structures within which this could coexist was clear. I don't think since then there was much of a chance because that consensus failed. Essentially, there was, since democracy essentially started faltering for a good 20 years in both countries, and Azerbaijan continues, so that this true human rights, true democratization, true European integration model doesn't work. And I don't think there is any kind of a bigger picture path towards sustainable peace. In terms of solution, so that's the pessimistic version where I agree with Lala. But let me kind of give a bit of a more positive spin here too. There are two other approaches to conflict management and conflict transformation. And these ones I think are very much possible. So management, let me start with that. It's probably, it doesn't mean any solution. It just means continually working to stop or minimize violence. And that one is a type of work that has to be done, I think, always, and has been done for many years, of course, when there was no solution. I think in a way we can continue that somewhat successfully because the reasons for a large-scale war are reduced in a sense, at least between Armenia and Azerbaijan. A lot of the reasons for it are no longer present. So I think it's possible to intensely continue working on preventing any new large-scale war. So to that extent, I think it's possible. That management. And then if we go to the other extreme is conflict transformation, which assumes bigger transformations. So it's not keeping everything intact and doing a peace agreement, which I think is just a piece of paper at this stage, but like transforming deeper things. And some conversations we are hearing, such as changing constitutions potentially. So these are not two nations framed primarily to be enemies to each other, but potentially some other form of national identity. That's on the government level, but also Lala mentioned can be also like more grassroots level, more social movements level changes. So this is a type of work that can happen also on societal level. And one big difference I see now, in my view, compared to last 10, 15 years preceding the war, there is a stronger movement, interestingly, towards peace, many more genuine actors, let's say, engaging than I have seen for, I think, last 2 decades prior to the war. So in a sense, I do see a good grassroots movement. However strong it is, we are to see. I also see a movement on the government side. So I think transformation in the longer term is possible.
Thank you. As we are speaking tomorrow, there is finally a meeting between the two foreign ministers in Berlin. It seems like there seems to be some process with the European involvement, but I'm going to leave those aspects out for today's discussion. I would rather, we can touch upon if you'd like to, but my question will be, in general, where we stand now. And it seems like there are some pessimistic notes, obviously, for prospects for peace. But as Phil was mentioning, conflict management and transformation may have a chance in so many forms and shapes. My general question is, what is just taking into account your experience of track 2 and track 1.5, maybe, what is or can be the role of that track 2 and let's say various actors, be it civil society, be it journalists, be it scholars, pretty much all the actors. What are we sort of witnessing today after, let's say, 25 years of dialoguing in so many different ways, having wars like we had? Where can we go with this, and where is it that track 2 or track 1.5 can be useful?
This track 1 and track 2 processes, again, very tricky processes in my opinion, because I'll be speaking on Azerbaijan, about Azerbaijan's experience. It's not clear what is track 2 in the case of Azerbaijan, because it's not clear how you can communicate with the government and how you can approach the government. I think this process is happening on different levels. There are experts, or there are people who government trust and can talk to them. but again, this is not a transparent process that can be controlled or can be intervened by a broader civil society, let's say. So it's a process that can happen behind the closed doors, or basically anyone who is considered, let's say, the conflict expert, analyst, will be or on more independent, and let's say will be writing on publicly on social media and open resources, and maybe their opinion will be taken into account. But other than that, maybe before it used to work, there were like processes where experts were involved in track 2. There was Karabakh Council at one point, I remember. But if we talk right now, post 2020 and the period, very short period before 2020, I don't think these track 2 processes was really working, to be honest, or if it was working, then it was only behind the closed doors and not transparent and accountable for the general public, so that people who are not involved in this will be aware about the outcomes of this process. So that's why I think if there is, for example, any EU regulated process of negotiations, and then EU organizes a track 2 process with the experts, and then Azerbaijani experts are participating, that can be something I see possible. But like on a domestic level, when I know like experts in Armenia easily involved in track 2 process and advising or conversation with the government, I don't think this is entirely possible in Azerbaijan, but I'm not also saying that it's not happening. I think it's happening with some limited number of experts, let's say.
If I can, put still a bit of a more positive spin, I think I'm slightly more, not optimistic is not the word, but I think I see more possibilities. I think that track 1.5, track 1 we'll discuss hopefully at some point. I think whether bilateral talks or multilateral and all. But on track 1.5, understood as, right, so some kind of expert levels close to government type of engagement or advising government type of engagement. I do think it's absolutely necessary. I think that's one thing that's somewhat independent of democratization processes. If track 2 requires, institutional civil society involvement, track 1.5 doesn't, in a way. And actually, I'm studying now authoritarian activism in authoritarian states. And one of the things you see is that exactly that kind of expert track 1.5 level engagement is one of the things that can continue, because authoritarian or not, governments need some form of expert advice. So that's where I see that actually as one of the things that is possible actively. I think it's also necessary, especially when it comes to both this management and transformation track I was mentioning, because again, for management, I think these are the people who can stay in touch with each other, better understand what's happening internally, and essentially help de-escalate, keep the conversation going, even if there is a breakdown on a track 1 level. But also for transformation, I think they can potentially advise on things like, how to change commemoration that is still there without necessarily promoting high sense of enmity, things like that. So I do see track 1.5, in my view, always necessary. Of course, yes, it needs that the government effectively to accept that. But I think it has been happening, and this continues to be happening one way or another, maybe on a smaller scale than we should have it. But on the track 2, again, I'm not sure if it's track 2 anymore. Track 2, again, assumes some form of a connection of civil society with the governments. I agree that requires a level of democracy, which, currently you see that in Armenia, civil society actors do interface with government. You don't see it in Azerbaijan, and that's expected given the extent of authoritarianism. But I see, again, there is a lot of more genuine, more taking ownership into its own hands, groups of people, experts, younger people appearing, who are very more and more vocal. And I think they're pushing things into the agenda that otherwise would not have been, to use European bureaucratic language, human security agenda, right? But issues that are, so it's not only kind of hard, borders and trains, but also it considers, the border populations, the property rights of the displaced, psychosocial issues, and so on. So I think there is more voices in that direction. I think that's also important. There's more track 3 probably than track 2. Track 2, yeah, does require a degree of democracy, which we probably don't have.
Yeah, or multi-track, right? I mean, if we can go that way. But getting back to the sort of moving from track 1.5 to track 1, we do know that in some cases it seems like maybe somewhat of a track 1.5 is happening right now with regards to, for example, the prisoners exchange in December. It seems like before there was some kind of a deal between the parties. Some work has been done, right, underground or behind the closed doors. And if you can touch upon somewhat of the importance, you already spoke about no matter what regime in the country is, you do need the expert advice, and I think that's very true. But also the case of bilateral talks, I want to sort of move into that, right? People who followed this conflict know the framework within which we were negotiating before 2020, the so-called OSCE Minsk group. I don't want to go into the details right now. And it seems like there is really no effective mediation so far since 2020. There is a process with Russia, which is stopped. There is a process with the European Union. The US was trying to take a role in this. Do we even need these mediators at all? And is there a chance for a true bilateral talks? And if yes, if there is, are there some issues that need to be resolved, or do we need some form of confidence building before a true bilateral effective discussions can take place?
So yeah, I think that's a big difference between now and again and every previous decade. Once again, I would separate 90s and maybe part of 2000s out here. I think it was a very different situation where Russia itself was somewhat integrating with the West, at least democratizing, and overall there was a consensus again, as I mentioned before, right? So through the liberal democratization solution. So in that context, the Minsk group was to still each country played maybe to its own interest, but overall there was somewhat of a consensus of how the solution should look like. It's very different post 2020, not only because there was a war, obviously that as well, but because essentially we are seeing big conflicts on a geopolitical level, and now each actor is essentially involved not necessarily as a neutral mediator in any serious sense of that term, but very much as a third party on its own, right? So it's actually Russia on the table. It's actually Russia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, 3 parties essentially negotiating their own interest in Caucasus. Is not necessarily Russia being there as a mediator. Same applies, I believe, to the European Union, and same applies to the United States. Now, the difference could be that, at least since 2012, I would say very explicitly, Russia interest was in continuation of a conflict, and its kind of way of keeping influence in the region was playing Armenia and Azerbaijan against each other. So in that sense, Russian mediation is even more problematic than, say, US, who, for no good reason necessarily, but to oppose this, essentially, its interest is the peace in this particular case, which can potentially make Armenia, Azerbaijan closer to the West, right? So I wouldn't say US, for example, could be an effective mediator in a Gazan case where it's supporting one side, but in our case, it so happened for its own interest, it prefers peace, not continuation of war. So in that sense, they see this as self-interested actors rather than mediators. Again, some of them are more interested potentially for their own reasons in peace than others. So that's one. And having said that, I still see a role for the third parties potentially in that conflict management end of the conversation. Again, you need to situationally think in which case which actor is interested and potentially engage with them. So that's one version of engaging with third parties. But second one is technical expertise, I would say. So I do, and here I will fully turn to support your idea or to question argument that bilateral talks are probably key, because instead of 3, these are 2 actors negotiating. You don't negotiate with Russia and Azerbaijan or Russia and Armenia, you negotiate directly, and these are the 2 that eventually have to come to an agreement. So I think I do prioritize bilateral talks as the most important, but I think there is a place where there is a need for technical expertise. A very simple example is from what I know, I can see a limit to which current Armenian government being relatively new to governance, might lack some degree of negotiation skills or writing serious 5,000-page peace proposal skills, which requires a lot of details and could make mistakes that then will provide very costly. So in that sense, I can see potentially Swiss expertise coming in, invited by Armenians, Azerbaijanis to help draft the technical level. Yeah, so essentially it's bilateral with potentially foreign expertise as needed invited. So I think that's one version, and helping with the management through doctors who are interested. I think that's two ways I see international involvement.
So if
but necessarily owned by the Armenia and Azerbaijan at this stage.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand you correctly, just to instead of having an umbrella, to have technical support when needed and expertise, basically.
Absolutely. I think as in terms of moving towards some kind of a solution, transformation, peace agreement, yes, as in we negotiate the big picture and directly, bilaterally, but then invite outside expertise for draft. How the water sharing agreements are not an easy agreements to draft, right? So I don't know, demarcation agreements and so on and so forth. So having, in this case, international expertise as invited. So that's one. But again, on the other hand, I think you do need to engage with Russia, with US, with European Union, with a lot of other actors. But again, as third actors, not as mediators necessarily, but as third parties interested in having their own interest in the region. So in that sense, you do need to negotiate bilaterally, say Armenia, US, or Armenia, India, but you also might want to have Armenia, Azerbaijan, US, Armenia, Azerbaijan, India, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Russia meetings. But just treat that as third country with its own interests, not a neutral mediator.
Lala, John, what do you think about the possibility for bilateral?
Yeah, I will mostly agree with Phil in this sense that I think the third parties and mediators did a lot of harm than any help in this conflict throughout the years, starting from 90s and continuing with today. That's why I'm honestly very strongly opposed any third party involvement in negotiations and mediation process. I would rather think of involving I understand that there is a big mistrust between the parties to each other, and that's why mediation. That's why the negotiations are installed. But on the other hand, I think we have a huge peace-building community and a huge community who can help in this negotiations process without external mediators. So if there is indeed such a huge need for mediation and the parties cannot directly talk, why not to involve the peace builders from both countries and the people who are not indifferent, who have expertise and knowledge about the conflict and are not the third parties, as Phil said. They are not mediators in most of the cases, starting from European Union, going to Russia, US, whatever, yeah, right? Turkey, France, all of them have their own interests, which rather makes the conflict even more complicated rather than bringing any solutions. That's why I think bilateral talks for me is a good thing, but there are also a lot of discussions and arguments that there is a very huge power imbalance right now on the Azerbaijani side, and Armenia is not really strong to negotiate. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, can these countries actually somehow pressure on Azerbaijan, influence the process of negotiations? I don't see the point and value of this third party being involved and instead of helping, actually antagonizing one of the sides. So in that sense, I would be very strongly against the third-party mediation and in favor of bilateral talks.
Lala, thank you very much. I did have a formal question about the role of peace builders and conflict resolution or conflict management professionals. You sort of touched upon it, and I want to continue building on it. Mm-hmm. Do you see a specific role that at this point Armenian and Azerbaijani peace builders can play, whether it's openly, whether it's publicly, or somehow else, supporting, mm-hmm. following up on Phil's question, point on the expertise that can be helpful for both parties?
Absolutely, why not? I mean, this starting from 90s, people were very much active in peace building, and there were people negotiating the exchange of prisoners in 90s, and we very well know their names. I mean, why not to continue this? Why not to think different about negotiations? Why it should be a closed-door negotiations? Why we cannot control this process as a public from both sides? I think one of the main reasons of failure of these 30 years was it's the very closed, unaccountable process of negotiations, and then everyone was from Azerbaijani side blaming that the peace is impossible, blah blah blah, war was the only option. I don't think so. There was never a chance given actually to peace in a genuine and broader sense. So why not to look at negotiations from different perspectives again, to open up it, to involve the peace builders, involve the grassroots. There are a lot of cases from other countries. Azerbaijan and Armenia are not the first ones and are not the only ones in the world who are engaged in conflict. And when we look at the case studies of how the grassroots movements, peace building communities, civil society were involved in negotiations process and helped the drafting of peace agreement, helped the negotiations. I don't understand why we can't do this, especially if there is already a built trust between the community of peace builders, meaning that there is no need for a third party to build this confidence, to make the parties to trust each other. Why not to include this type of people in the informal negotiation process? Why not to have their presence in the room? Or if there is indeed a need for mediation, why not to involve their mediation, this expertise? So yeah, I think that's pretty much possible.
Great. Before I sort of get to you, Phil, with the same question, I just want to mention that it seems to me, and I was at a discussion with Armenians in this case, discussing where we stand nowadays from the perspective of negotiations. And some of the people were saying, at least on the Armenian end, the negotiations have not been as transparent as they are now. And by that, they meant that pretty much every point that is being discussed, because they don't work out or whatever, it comes out. Either the prime minister comes out and says something about that, or politicians. It seems like in case of Armenia, they're also bringing together some of the experts and civil society members to sort of discuss what they spoke with the Azerbaijani side. Do you agree with this, Philip? Do you think the negotiations now are transparent?
Absolutely not. Strongly disagree. Actually, I think there is more talk in public about it by the prime minister and governing party. I don't believe it's reflective of what's actually being discussed. So I think it's a lot of manipulation for internal political purposes. And so, by the way, very different things can be said by the same people. Okay, yes, there is some consistency in terms of overall trying to move towards peace and be compromised. That's true. So that's absolutely. But that's already the things that already happened, essentially being explained, rather than things that are potentially in discussion for moving forward. I think if anything, is probably the closest right now negotiation process, one of the closest ones I've seen. And maybe I'm a bit more ambivalent on this one compared to Lala. I think there is also a place for potentially some, closed door direct negotiations, because there can be also sabotage there, especially on Armenian side, being more democratic, but you have stronger opposition, right? So there have to be some serious compromises, and if they are kind of taken out of context, out of bigger picture, there piece by piece can be sabotaged. So I can see why potentially you might want to come to some kind of a more comprehensive agreement before necessarily making it public. So I do see a space potentially for close talks before you have some kind of even serious chance to agree, which I don't know if they have right now. So again, having said that, I do believe there are talks, whether in different formats or bilateral, and I don't think they are necessarily in a bigger picture truly communicated to the public, or for that matter for the civil society, including in Armenia. Yes, piece by piece things are discussed, some expertise is sought on both ends, by the way. I don't think the bigger picture is necessarily clear or necessarily transparent. So sorry, but I will have to disagree. And again, but having said that, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing from my point of view. But if I can go to your question of where is the role of peace building community at this point, Again, Lala, somewhat I can see a challenge to the vision you are proposing, because again, it assumes democratization or somewhat of a presence of democracy, kind of space for civil society engaging, taking more of ownership, as in given from the top in a way, that openness. I think it requires more democratic structures than we have in big parts of the region, of course, including in Azerbaijan, but also Russia, Turkey are not irrelevant in that sense. So I don't know if that model works, but I do see some things that you also both said, and I agree with that. There has been actually pretty serious voices, very deep thinkers and activists who've been around for a long time, or a lot of them new, but who are taking ownership in terms of thinking of what's next. I haven't seen, in my view, maybe it was the 90s, but I think for a long time it was somewhat of a stagnation of thought, in a way, of what's possible, preceding, in a way, the Second Karabakh War. I think there was a lot of people now came in understanding that they cannot just let this go, continue to escalate, and they want to take ownership of the process. And I'm actually positively surprised of how many people following the war actually engaged in peace building, and how many serious people from whom you can learn a lot in very different sectors of the society. And of economy and what else. So I think there is many more people actively thinking, I want to do something about this than I've seen before. And again, I see this is much more genuine and much more deeply rooted, let's say. So I do see a potential for not necessarily the track-to process, but in different sectors, things transforming, because people are just tired of continual fighting. Again, education being potentially one area, the environment being another, right? So there are some areas where we might start seeing hopefully change. So I see a lot of sectors where we need to make change to move towards solution. And that can be done on expert level, community level.
And you think that's possible without top level political will, at least on the end of Azerbaijan?
Again, I think we are thinking in terms, that's where I'm trying to move away from conflict resolution framing. If we are talking about peace agreement, no, that should be done by governments. And for me right now, it's a piece of paper. I think it doesn't have, whether they sign it or not, it's somewhat marginal in terms of the relationship and the potential escalations and so on. I don't think that peace agreement has the same meaning that, some kind of agreement in the 90s would have had. So that's government's not going to let anybody close. They're going to do it or not, right? So, but somewhat for me, that's secondary document. I'm thinking about, again, managing violence in everyday sense, as I said, and that's one process, somewhat separate from negotiations, and transformation in different sectors, right? There's a lot of conversation about constitutional changes, which in my view makes sense because, again, they have been very rooted in a way, the situation of the 90s, and they are very much mutually exclusive. But whether we agree or not that they should happen, we are seeing both governments in some form moving in that direction, right? I think this is one place where civil society experts, academics can come in having a voice, whether governments want it or not, right? Somehow make it public noise about how this next institution, if there is going to be a change or referendum or something, going to look like. So this is one area you can make a noise. Yeah, so push your way into it, essentially. And you are seeing it already happening to a degree. Again, environmentalists, right? If there is like a water sharing, water pollution and so on, you can get into that sector. So I see it more like transforming sector by sector. That not necessarily participation in a peace agreement draft, if it makes sense.
Just to sort of finish it, when you're talking about, let's say, educational reform, you mean each country does it on its own, or you can
basically
cooperation there on like, I mean, I don't want to get into a big topic which you guys have been working on. If people follow Caucasus Edition, they will find articles about how history textbooks are being written, how narratives are being built. But I mean, it's probably too early to speak about joint projects on issues like that, right?
From my perspective, you don't even need joint projects anymore, because I think the jointness, for many reasons. I think we're still, in my view, 90s mindset, where essentially it was two newly post-colonial states overall on the same trajectory towards democratization in the European Union. Plus, we had Karabakh kind of shared, of course, dilemma to deal with. So that was all requiring parallelism. At this point, very violently, the conflict has been transformed. Unfortunately, peace-building community completely failed, in my view, of making any positive change. We have what we have, right? So we have complete ethnic cleansing of Karabakh. We have completely different trajectories at this point of Armenian and Azerbaijan developments. So I think as countries, so I think then what needs to be done in Azerbaijan, what needs to be done in Armenia is completely different, essentially. So we can, but yeah, so you can potentially do more public pressure for education reform, or like a more public debate in media in Armenia. And by all means, for Armenia's own sake, that debate should happen, right? Very different story when you are working with an entrenched authoritarian regime in Azerbaijan. What's needed there? Probably democratization in the first place, right? So it's a very different process that's now needed. In Azerbaijan, you cannot have same level of public debate. You cannot have, right? So civil society input into education reform, right? So it doesn't mean Armenia shouldn't do it, or it doesn't mean Azerbaijan should not focus on democratization, and so on. So I think what's needed becoming very different at this point. So we can support each other. We can have some areas where, I don't know, water sharing, another example I keep using, where you need to cooperate, right? But in many other areas, I think the trajectories are too different right now. So the interventions that are necessary, let's say, are different.
Mm-hmm.
If I may add very small on this, I mostly agree with Phil, but two things I want to add. First, I think even without, I think Azerbaijan's democratization, I see the possibility of involvement of peace builders in negotiations process. There is no necessity to make it open or whatever, right? That's, I think, a bigger, broader future picture. But at this stage, I think even in Azerbaijan, it's possible to advocate and negotiate and lobby for such things, that at least one or two people can be involved in this type of
I agree with that.
Yes. Yeah. And about the cooperation and differentiated approach, I pretty much agree we need a differentiated approach to developments in our countries. But I think sometimes we are just focusing really very strongly on the governments, while, for example, there are a lot of different opportunities which we can use. For example, a regional work, online work. It's a different period. It's not 90s anymore. Like through this type of online conversations and communications, peace building or civil society community can build joint media. They can do a joint educational institution in Georgia, right? Very different approaches can be used if we are not just focusing on government, and it will maybe not resolve the conflict, but it will be contributing to the transformation of the conflict.
By the way, I fully support both things you just said, so don't sound like we are contradicting each other in that sense. Yes, by all means, I said from the start, right? So by expert advice is very much, I think, even to a degree welcomed and should continue, and that can be the way to involve. By all means, we need to build regional institutions and regional, wherever they are, in whatever shape and form, especially on education and analytic level, let's say.
It seems to me, though, if just building on what Lala was just saying, a joint media is an excellent idea, I think, and some other forms of cooperation can happen. But is it, I find it very difficult to see an option for that to happen in Armenia proper and in Azerbaijan proper. Does the diaspora or diasporas have a role to play in this?
I think so, absolutely. I think diaspora's potential should be explored and needs to be explored. Also, always tend to be that diaspora is even more nationalistic than people in the countries, but still not necessarily. There are different type of people, for example, in Azerbaijan right now, for example, who will be contributing and are contributing to peace building, but temporarily or at some point are outside of the country. So I think diaspora plays a role, definitely, and we need to, I think and explore how we can work with diaspora, because so far, again, it was very much dominated by more nationalistically oriented discourses and groups. But even if not diaspora, I still think people who are in the country and trying to build this type of joint media, that shouldn't be a problem, because I think I was watching your conversations, this program so far, and some of the experts are the people who are in country, who are living there. So I don't think that this is necessarily a dangerous job or activities that will be very dangerous for people in Azerbaijan or in Armenia. So within country, it's possible to do.
And on this point, and I agree with you that it sort of is becoming more and more possible, would you say that there is a larger interest from Azerbaijan after the victory to speak with Armenians, because it was much more difficult before, for sure, to get guests from Azerbaijan, and now it seems like there is one. Is that true?
Absolutely, I think so. There's more interest, at least on the politically active level of society, let's say, the civil society, what we call it. Absolutely, I think more interest and more openness to talk to Armenians. Of course, not saying that all of them are genuine and all of them are like very peace-oriented and considering the compromise. But again, I think there is a lot of openness, a lot of interest to basically, start talking and basically leaving the conflict in the past.
Well, not surprisingly, probably also the winning side.
Before you speak about it, moving into you, would you say that now we have some sort of the mirror reflection or sort of changing the spots? Are we having more difficulty to get Armenians to speak to Azerbaijanis these days?
Yes, that was exactly what. Thank you. I was going to say not even close. So it was before you had 3-1. Let's say any call we make, any program we organize, we had 3-1 like Armenians to Azerbaijanis ratio. Now it's exactly reverse. So we have so many great Azerbaijani applicants practically into anything, and it's very difficult to find enough for qualified Armenians to participate. Yeah, very much the case.
Okay, because we're limited in time, we have to sort of do this within an hour. I want to sort of ask a somewhat of about at least one of the biggest questions in Armenia today. Is there a chance for a full-scale war? Philip, you touched upon it, saying you don't see a big chance, but I sort of would like to sort of hear you out on this. And just to add for Azerbaijani side, a question. Things like so-called Zangezur corridor and other things, do those things resonate with Azerbaijanis these days? I mean, Karabakh is now, there are no Armenians left there. Aliyev is celebrating victory. Like, I don't want to sort of give those things, but not just from the geopolitical perspective, but also in the minds of the people in case of Azerbaijan. And of course, Philip, maybe you can also give because that's the number one concern in Armenia right now. Wherever you go, that's a big question. So what's your take on the possibility of a full-scale war?
Can start I don't think it's out of question, actually. That doesn't mean that. I'll tell you why. Because I think there is no particular reason for a war. What I was saying. So I was saying it's possible to manage and prevent it. But I do see a possibility of a war for two reasons. One is that we have no other paradigm, essentially. So that big picture I was discussing in the past, which was essentially democratization and integration into European Union structures in some form, open borders and so on. So that's out. So we have a very fractured, kind of overall very authoritarian region, and both national identities in these 30-something years, so before too, but especially in this 30-something years, are completely built on mutual exclusion and mutual enmity. So essentially, this is very now central, and there has been so much violence, including recently, that feeds into it. So overall, kind of almost any national mobilization right now, any kind of national unity is against the other. So for almost any crisis, any need to somehow consolidate any economic crisis almost will create a necessity for more war. So I see essentially right now we have simply no other paradigm but to continue fighting. So the war is possible as a result any moment for potentially other reasons, right? So such as economic crisis being one. So that's why I see very strong potential any moment again, because simply we didn't solve. Not only we didn't solve anything, we built identities that are effectively sustained by mutual enmity, and that's not going anywhere yet. That's one. But there is a second one, which is probably bigger one in terms of immediate war, is what's happening geopolitically in the region and in the world. And Armenia's move towards the West. It's completely understandable. Russia completely failed its obligations and so on and so forth. Completely understandable. sentiment and even strategically what Armenian government is trying to do. But we also have seen with Georgia and with Ukraine that it can bring literally to direct invasion. So it's not, and whether it's direct invasion by Russia or some kind of alliance where Russia and Azerbaijan somehow make a deal. But I think that essentially once Russia is a bit less busy in Ukraine, whether it's advances more or the other way gets stalled and signs some kind of ceasefire de facto agreement, probably turns to Caucasus and Moldova. And then you have now whether it's Russian invasion directly or is it Russia, Baku, like Baku actually invades for some kind of a shared deal. I think that very much can become the next, depends, Trump comes to presidency or not, right? How much green light Putin gets. So I think there are this kind of completely unpredictable development, especially past November, especially should Trump come to power. But even if not, right? So it's very much possible that we become victims simply in another geopolitical game in some kind of a bigger Russia, Turkey, whoever deal. So that one is almost outside of our hands, unless we actually manage to sign some kind of an agreement and somehow try to insulate the Caucasus from this. That's where I see, even if Azerbaijan has a winning hand in the short term, if you look a century or two, like our independence overall of Caucasus has been, not the norm. It's an exception. And, I don't know, sometimes through Azerbaijan, Russian army this time they can go through Armenia, but whichever direction it is in a bigger picture, I think the independence and sovereignty of countries in Caucasus do require peace, very volatile region. So I think that bigger scare hopefully should push us towards solution. But I think, again, at least for two reasons, I see potential for a big war. One, internal, some kind of crisis in any of the countries, and second, external. So I think it's very bleak, the bigger picture.
Thank you, Phil. Lala?
Yeah, if I will go back to your question about the mood in Azerbaijan about this topic, about the so-called Western Azerbaijan discourse, I think it's not militarized as the Karabakh discourse. Basically, I am not sure how many people will be mobilized to support the war under this discourse, but I'm sure there will be a lot of people supporting this. And whether this is resonating with people, definitely this is resonating with people. But what I'm trying to say, it's not as militarized as was the Nagorno-Karabakh and Karabakh discourse before, where the consensus was that if no peace, then war is the only solution, basically, and everyone supported it. So how, again, this will be mobilized, it's a big question for me. I am not sure whether it will be as effective as was the Karabakh. But whether this militarization is building around this discourse, it is also happening. This is what we see, that there is this Western Azerbaijan community that is very active after 2020 war, by the way. And there is a lot of statements by the Aliyev himself about again, Western Azerbaijan and Yerevan being whatever, right? So this is something is building around it, but how it will end up, I don't know, it's hard to say. But I really agree with Phil that we live in a very uncertain times when wars are in our region, both in Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, and it's a very normalized thing, not just in the region, but within our conflict. War was proven as a normal solution of this conflict, basically, even if not solution, but for one of the sides, basically a solution for the conflict to get something, right? That's why. For example, if tomorrow Armenia decides to move further towards the EU, gets out from the CSTO, what will be the consequences? How it will turn out? We don't know, right? There are a lot of I think external factors that we cannot control and we cannot predict, which can contribute to the war on a bigger scale. So I wouldn't exclude it either, but at this stage, like if we are trying to predict or analyze something for the upcoming ones, I don't think it's there. But whether this is a question, whether this is a possibility, I agree with Phil very much that this is still a possibility.
Well, it is definitely the number one central issue still based on all research in Armenia for most everyone. Security sort of is the priority for people. Obviously, we can understand why. And then just the last question, actually, in this regard, how would you assess, because the Armenian side right now, being the losing side and being the weakened side, is obviously ready for a lot of concessions for a peace deal. Maybe that's not viewed like that from Azerbaijan, I don't know, but I'm speaking from that perspective. And this will be the last question, and I'll ask you to be as short as possible, just so that we can keep it within the time. How genuine do you think are the negotiations that are happening? And I want to remind our viewers that, again, tomorrow we have on February 29th, we have the foreign ministers of the two countries meeting after almost 6 months of a no negotiations. And how much value is there in those meetings, besides the very fact that they are shaking hands and sitting around a table and sort of showing, at least to the world, that there is some kind of a diplomatic process?
To keep it very short, if you remember the December statement, I think it was in December statement by Armenia-Azerbaijan, which was very bilateral, I wouldn't exclude that there is some genuine efforts to move to agree on some things. But since there is almost no trust in each other, how's this genuine effort, like how we can call it genuine? Because the people coming to the table with zero trust to each other, thinking that the person in front of them will sitting there just to deceive, to lie to them and try to gain something. And with this mindset, I don't think that you can move with the negotiations, right? But for me, what happened in December was a very huge step, because this was bilateral. It showed and proved that actually they can talk and agree on something. So meaning that I don't exclude some genuine efforts to come to some conclusions. But since it's very limited information we have, and almost no progress from basically this was the only isolated case of success, it's very hard to believe that some genuine negotiations are happening.
I do not know if it's a question of the genuine belief. I think in principle, for very pragmatic reasons, the Armenian government right now wants to or needs to compromise. And I think Azerbaijan government want to take a lot, but in principle also probably settle to a degree. The question is then, for me, a couple of things. First of all, right, is there an overlap? As in how I think Azerbaijan potentially is demanding so much that makes it unacceptable to Armenia, not on any kind of rhetorical level, but makes Armenia a non-viable state, right? If you cut out the roads to the east, to the south and the north, essentially Armenia as a state cannot survive. You're going to have another mass exodus. It's just you're going to have demographic problem, let alone economic and so on, right? So essentially, it's as good as eliminating Armenia as a state. It's in the 10 years speed. So I think Azerbaijan potentially probably is asking too much, making it simply impossible for Armenians to accept. That's one. On the other hand, I also see that there is the mistrust point. I think is very important. I think it was very important deal in a big picture. I'm not minimizing the lives, but absolutely important, really great thing was done. In terms of a bigger peace agreement, I think we are too far from it still, because I think my mistrust expertise, from what I can discern, the words are said that are not understood the same way. Yeah, so everything is interpreted either to the maximally positive or to the maximally negative end. There is, there is just not enough clear communication, not enough, again, expertise communication. There is a limit to which I think this bilateral, very close talks can take us. So I'll contradict somewhat myself. I think it has to be the basis of the negotiation. It has to be bilateral. It has to be the key few players. But I think they by all means need a lot of expertise and advice from how exactly the demarcation going to happen to how to a lot of how security guarantees can be done in this very unstable world and so on, which I think does need a lot of expertise, both ideally local, Lala was mentioning, but I say also international. This is not the first war is not the first peace agreement, right? So there's a lot of expertise that I don't think is being sought out, right? So I think there's a limit to which this 3, 4, 5, whatever number of people are talking on the top are able to take this. Yes, they can make a one-off deal, but not necessarily full peace agreement. So I think there they need to seek at least close the expertise.
Thank you, Philippe, and thank you, Lala. Let's hope that some of the progress that we've made on the bilateral level, obviously, will actually continue happening, whether it's tangible outcomes such as last December's when prisoners were exchanged, where at least there was some kind of positive progress. Other than that, thank you for doing your work. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to remind to our viewers that today's guests for AliQ Media were Lala Darchinova, originally from Azerbaijan. She's an editor of Caucasus Edition with the Imagine Center of Conflict Transformation, a researcher of the Law Department of European University Institute in Florence, and Philippe Gamaghelyan, also editor of Caucasus Edition with Imagine from University of San Diego Kroc School of Peace Institute. Thank you so much for joining us today. And this series of Building a Bridge is being sponsored by Yerevan Press Club and Baku Press Clubs. We do hope to continue this discussion with you. There are many other questions that I would love to ask you guys, and keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arsen.